Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. It is easy, from a modern seat, to picture armies as men in motion, boots on stone, flags raised, banners curled in the wind. But not all generals lead such armies, okay? And not all wars are declared with horns and drums. Some are written into the silence between confessions, into the ink that never dries in the margins of forgotten letters. Some armies were trained not to fire, but to think, to whisper, to watch, and to endure. The Jesuit superior general, often called the Black Pope, not for his skin, but for the black robes of his order and the quiet power he held, was just such a general. In the Society of Jesus, his army was founded not for conquest in the conventional sense, but to defend a different kind of kingdom too, okay? Understand why his power has been whispered about for centuries and why it still stirs uneasy breath. In the margins of history books, one must begin not in the Vatican, but in the flickering ruin of post-Reformation Europe. The 1500s were loud. Fires crackled around books and heretics. Nations split their faith like splitting logs. Kings aligned with popes one year, against them the next. The Catholic Church, ancient, weighty, full of relics and rules, was bleeding credibility. And then came a soldier, limping. Ignatius of Loyola was not yet a saint, not yet a founder. He was just a man with a shattered leg and too many restless thoughts. Wounded in a military campaign, he convalesced in a castle with little more than devotional texts to pass the hours. But where others might have resigned themselves to stillness, Ignatius began to reshape his soul. He mapped out spiritual exercises like a tactician plans a battlefield. He trained himself in private to listen. And in time, he would gather others, not around wealth or land, but around a kind of discipline so strict, so internal, that it seemed invisible to most. The Society of Jesus was approved by Pope Paul III in 1540, but it was not founded with the pomp of parades or cathedral dedications. Its men swore vows not only of chastity and poverty, but of total obedience. Obedience not just to the Pope, but to their superior general. One man elected for life, often unknown to the public, seen by most, but whispered about in royal chambers and feared in Protestant courts. This man, they would say, did not command armies, he commanded minds. The first superior general was Ignatius himself, but his successors were less visible. While the Pope ruled over doctrine, the Black Pope ruled over action. Jesuits spread through the globe, not as missionaries of peace alone, but as scholars, scientists, and yes, occasionally, spies. They opened schools, they advised kings. They were so trusted that in many courts they knew what monarchs ate for breakfast. And when the church needed information about rebellions, rumors, or reformers, they did not always turn to bishops. They turned to the Jesuits. But what made the superior general so feared was not just his network, it was his discretion. He had no palace, no treasury, no seat in the College of Cardinals, and yet he could command movements across continents. He received letters in code. He issued orders in languages not spoken aloud, and his reach extended to the most unlikely places. A seminary in Mexico, a boarding school in Poland, a quiet parish in Kerala. Jesuits were everywhere, and they were all, by vow, bound to him. This led to friction, quiet, drawn out, and persistent. Other orders in the church saw the Jesuits as too ambitious, too close to power, too loyal not just to Rome, but to the general himself. Even popes grew wary. One papal document from the early 1600s warned against those who wield influence without showing their hand. No name was mentioned. None needed to be. By the 1700s, rumors swirled like smoke that the Black Pope had his own shadow court within the Vatican, that no major decision, not a treaty, not a doctrine, not a war, happened without Jesuit ears hearing it first. That the general had agents in Protestant cities, not to preach, but to watch. The truth was both less sinister and more impressive. Jesuits were trained not just in theology, but in rhetoric, astronomy, linguistics, and political strategy. They were useful to everyone, and that is what made them dangerous. And then came the unraveling. In the mid-18th century, monarchs across Europe began to expel the Jesuits. Portugal, France, Spain. Accusations were vague: sedition, economic meddling, secret influence. The real reason? The Jesuits had outlasted their welcome. They had advised too many rulers. They had opened too many schools. And their loyalty, always, was to Rome, and to the man in black who sat quietly in a corner of the Vatican, signing letters in Latin. In 1773, Pope Clement XIV, under pressure from Catholic monarchs, suppressed the entire order. Jesuits were scattered. Some disguised themselves as secular priests, others disappeared into distant colonies. The general at the time, Lorenzo Ricci, was imprisoned in Castel Sant'Angelo, where he died quietly. His papers confiscated, his correspondence sealed. It was said he never protested. He simply accepted the silence. But history, like a coiled spring, rarely stays quiet. Just 41 years later, in 1814, the Jesuit Order was restored, and the office of the Black Pope was reestablished, quietly, with little fanfare. The world had changed. Napoleon had risen and fallen. The Enlightenment had spread its secular gospel, but the Jesuits and their general had returned, and in modern times, the Black Pope remains. Today, he is elected by Jesuit delegates from around the world. He lives not in a palace, but in the Jesuit Curia, near the Vatican. His name is not secret, but his influence is still misunderstood. He does not make doctrine, does not sit on television panels. But when a Jesuit becomes Pope, as Jorge Mario Bergoglio did in 2013, the dynamic shifts again for the first time in history. The Pope and the Black Pope were both Jesuits, but only one wore a white dot. And so, you might wonder if the Black Pope no longer commands armies, no longer moves through palaces in shadows. What does he do? Does he still write in ciphered letters? Does he still pull strings from behind the curtain? Or is his power now symbolic, a relic of an age when silence spoke louder than scripture? And how many of the world's forgotten decisions, treaties signed, books banned, men excommunicated, bore his invisible fingerprints? The Vatican was never designed to be a place of noise. Its thick walls were made to absorb sound, not amplify it. In the Jesuit Curia, just steps beyond the bustling throngs of pilgrims and tourists, was even quieter. No bell towers, number, flags, just the silent rhythm of files being read, languages translated, and orders remembered. The superior general did not bark commands. He whispered direction into stillness, and yet those whispers echoed across empires. By the mid-19th century, the restored Society of Jesus had rebuilt its global web, but it had changed. It was no longer the daring missionary force that crossed oceans with Latin Bibles and folded astrolabes. Instead, it had become something subtler, a network of scholarship, diplomacy, and resilience. Jesuits taught at prestigious universities across Europe. They advised rising Catholic leaders in newly independent states in Latin America. They wrote encyclopedias. And beneath all of this, beneath the Latin footnotes and modest clerical titles, was the hand of the Black Pope. Yet, he was not an emperor. He was not elected with thunderous cheers or seated upon golden thrones. His power came from paper, from the meticulous reading of reports sent from Jesuits across 5 continents, from the ability to connect seemingly unconnected things, a bishop's hesitation in Bavaria, a new Protestant translation of Scripture in Uganda, a forgotten indigenous dialect in Peru. He did not command a kingdom. He managed an awareness, a living knowledge of how faith was surviving or failing. In corners of the world few others remembered. This led to unusual priorities where other church leaders might have focused on liturgical debates or papal declarations. The Black Pope issued directives about linguistics, agriculture, prison reform. One Jesuit letter from 1881, found decades later in an archive in the Philippines, instructed a mission not to build a chapel first, but to learn the rain calendar used by local farmers, so that their souls might be better understood through their fields. This was the genius of the Jesuits. They believed that to save a soul, you had to understand its surroundings, its weather, its language, its history of pain. But this approach also made them targets. Secular nationalists accused them of cultural meddling. Conservative bishops called them too modern. And monarchs, especially those building colonial empires, feared their quiet loyalty to Rome more than they feared any army. During the upheaval of the 20th century, the Jesuits did not vanish. They adapted. In the world wars, they served as chaplains. Some sheltered Jews, others died in camps. The general at the time, Władimir Zlatochowski, kept silent files of persecution reports. He moved Jesuits out of danger zones and into strategic territories. While Europe cracked, the society bent, but did not break. And after the war, their role shifted again. It is perhaps most intriguing to note that during the Cold War, when espionage and ideology split the world, the Vatican had no official intelligence service, but the Jesuits, well, they didn't need one. Jesuit universities were active in Moscow, in Washington, in Buenos Aires. Jesuit missionaries were present in villages along the Iron Curtain. They listened, documented, reported, not in secret files to the CIA or KGB, but in their own carefully maintained global awareness system. Their loyalty was not to any nation. It was to a structure older than most nations, and to the man in Rome, whose name appeared on few headlines but was known by every Jesuit around the world. He kept no army, but he commanded a global memory. Consider the way orders were passed, not with urgency, but with purpose. The general's circular letters, written in elegant Latin, were not so much commands as invitations. Remember the people of Nagasaki. One letter read in 1954, "Their silence is not absence." Another, in 1973, warned about the rise of commercial faith, religion used as a marketing tool. These weren't political manifestos. They were maps of thought. And yet, despite this quiet dignity, the rumors persisted, that the Black Pope had a secret agenda, that he influenced elections, that he operated a second Vatican. In 1983, an obscure French newspaper published an anonymous letter claiming Jesuits had orchestrated global events through their educational institutions. No proof was ever offered, but the myth endured, because myths often grow where silence thrives. But was there truth in any of it? That depends on what one means by power. If power is measured by armies, then no, the Black Pope wielded none. But if power is measured by influence, the kind that shapes minds, not ballots, then his reach was immense. China trained. Students became presidents, scientists, philosophers, and journalists, not because they were ordered to, but because they were taught how to think, how to doubt, how to examine a problem from all sides. That, perhaps, is what made the society so unique. Their ultimate obedience was not just to Rome, it was to reason. And that kind of obedience is harder to control than any sword. Still, not everything was. Noble in Latin America, Some Jesuit missions became entangled in liberation movements. They advocated for the poor, but were accused of stirring rebellion. In Eastern Europe, some collaborated with communist regimes to keep their schools open. Others resisted and disappeared into prisons. The general watched all of this unfold through endless pages of handwritten reports, each stamped with regional marks and folded with trembling fingers. It is easy now to romanticize this figure, but his life was not enviable. Every morning, the superior general rises not to applause, but to problems. He reads the suffering of others. He signs off on the movement of men who may not return. He balances ancient vows with modern crises, and he does all this without a throne, a crown, cora, public address. His tools are still paper and silence. In 2008, the 29th Superior General, Adolfo Nicolas, was elected. A Spaniard, soft-spoken, known for his intellect and humility. When asked what his priorities were, he replied, "Depth, not noise." It was a fitting summary. His job was not to lead revolutions. It was to keep a global order of thinkers alive. In a time that valued speed over substance, he would later resign. The first general in centuries to do so voluntarily due to health. His successor, Arturo Sosa, was elected in 2016, a Venezuelan, fluent in several languages, trained in political theory. The first Latin American to hold the role. And the first to do so in a world where Jesuits could tweet, livestream, and Zoom, but still choose not to. The Black Pope remains. A term used more by conspiracy theorists than by Catholics. It's a symbol of power that few understand and fewer see. But he is still there, in a room of maps and books. 8. In a building without flags. Managing a network built not on domination, but dialogue. Guarding not secrets, but memory. And you might wonder, hey, in a world that changes so quickly, that burns through trends, revolutions, and headlines, what does it mean that this one man still leads an invisible army? You're walking now, not through the streets of Rome, but deeper, past the arches, past the layers of history that tourists will never see, past the painted domes and gilded altars. Beneath it all is a quieter part of the Vatican. No frescoes, no stained glass, just rows of plain doors with plaques in Latin and staircases that curve not upward toward heaven, but downward into memory. This is where the archives live, but not the famous ones, not the secret archives of Vatican legend, where the papal bulls and excommunications are kept in velvet folders. These are different personal archives, Jesuit archives, reports, journals, school ledgers, and quiet letters, sent by missionaries to the man they simply called Father General. Inside one of these folders lies a letter, yellowed at the edges, dated 1934. It was sent from a Jesuit in northern China, not a bishop, not a famous scholar, just a humble teacher. The letter describes how his students, most of them children of farmers, began drawing pictures of constellations using dried millet seeds during break time. The teacher writes, "I have begun to ask them to explain these skies to me. They know more about the heavens than I do." The letter is not about politics, not even theology. It's about trust. A Jesuit priest asking a peasant child to teach him something, and sending that reflection across continents to Rome. That's the kind of power the Black Pope held, a power made not of fear, but of witness, of noticing, of recording what others would have dismissed. That's also why the Jesuits became so dangerous. They remembered things. Wherever they went, they took notes, on dialects, on calendars, on kinship rules, on the temperature of river water during monsoon season. These weren't just scientific curiosities. They were survival strategies. If you wanted to evangelize, you had to understand. And understanding required attention, not authority, by the 20th century. While most institutions chased progress through louder and faster methods, the Society of Jesus maintained its commitment to slowness. to depth. It wasn't fashionable, but it was effective. There's something unsettling about that, especially for those who deal in spectacle. While others made headlines, the Black Pope worked in the shadows of memory, gently weaving together a worldview too vast to see all at once. That brings us to the strangest thing about the Black Pope's legacy. How many times people have tried to erase it. Throughout history, the Society of Jesus has been suppressed, exiled, it's denounced, not because of what it did, but because of what it symbolized. A slow, quiet resistance to simplification. Jesuits resisted the flattening of cultures. They refused to use power in predictable ways, and they obeyed someone most governments didn't elect. This disobedience, cloaked in loyalty, was confusing. Even now, it feels contradictory. Jesuits vow obedience to Rome, but often challenge it. They renounce wealth, yet run prestigious institutions. They blend in, but influence greatly. The general embodies all of this tension. He doesn't wear silk. He doesn't live in the apostolic palace, but his voice has reached farther than many popes. Take, for instance, the way Jesuits handle conflict, not with declarations, but with questions. When the Cold War fractured the church and Marxist ideology swept through Latin America, the Jesuits didn't issue a single stance. Instead, they hosted hundreds of quiet forums, asking peasants, workers, landowners, and scholars to sit at the same table. It was messy. It was inconclusive. But it was real. The general didn't micromanage. He guided, and when things went wrong, as they often did, he didn't hide. He archived. Every crisis was recorded, not as a scandal, but as a lesson. That's the part few people understand. Jesuit power isn't about control. It's about memory, collective muscle trained to remember everything, even its own mistakes. That's also why the Black Pope has never been easy to pin down. He doesn't chase publicity, but he doesn't hide. He simply continues, organizing, reflecting, responding in a rhythm that hasn't changed much since 1540. In the modern age, this rhythm is harder to maintain. The world moves faster, crises multiply, faith fragments, but the general still rises early, still reads the night's letters, still signs off on 100 quiet decisions before the day begins. Where should a Jesuit mission retreat due to violence? Where should a scholar be reassigned after a health scare? Which remote dialect needs a translation team next year? He makes no speeches, but his calendar is full. And yet, the most important work he does isn't administrative. It's spiritual. Every Jesuit general is required to undergo the examen, a centuries-old ritual of daily reflection created by Ignatius of Loyola. It's not dramatic. It asks 5 things: to give thanks, to review the day, to notice failings, to seek forgiveness, and to look forward. Imagine doing that every day while leading a global network of priests, scientists, activists, and teachers. Imagine the weight of that silence, the kind that doesn't shout for attention or listens carefully to what others miss. It's why so many conspiracy theories have grown around the Black Pope. He feels too hidden. Calm people distrust what they cannot categorize. And yet, the truth is less cinematic. The Black Pope is not a puppet master. He is a custodian, a caretaker of complexity in a world that rewards simplicity. His most powerful weapon, the ability to listen longer than others can speak. So, why is he called the Black Pope? It's partly the uniform, the traditional black cassock of the Jesuit Order, partly the myth, the idea of a shadowy figure behind the throne, and partly the fear that someone, somewhere, might know more than the headlines admit. But if you go looking for a villain, you'll be disappointed. All you'll find is a room with no windows, a desk with stacked reports, a man reading page after page of names you've never heard, from villages you'll never visit. And he reads them not to command, but to care, because that's the secret no one talks about. The Black Pope isn't mysterious. because he hides. He's mysterious because he remembers and asks you to remember. 2. Now ask yourself, what kind of power lasts longer? The kind that makes you look, or the kind that helps you see? There is an old book, rarely seen, almost never quoted in sermons, that lives not on public shelves, but deep in the libraries of those who wear black cassocks with no embroidery. Its title is simple, Constitutions of the Society of Jesus, but its content is anything but. You've likely never heard of it. Most haven't. Even many within the church speak of it only vaguely. And yet, for nearly 5 centuries, this quiet document has directed one of the most unusual and powerful orders in Christian history, not with thunderous commandments, but with rhythms, disciplines, and expectations, almost monastic in their silence. It begins not with laws, but with a spiritual tension. The founder, Ignatius of Loyola, a wounded soldier turned mystic, did not draft his constitutions in a vacuum. He wrote them in fragments, in exile, in sickness, in slow, prayerful conversations with companions who had also walked away from the pride of nobility or the certainty of university walls. They didn't want a new religious order. Not really. They wanted flexibility to be ready for whatever God asked, and so the rules were written to be ... fluid, not vague, but adaptive, detailed, but never rigid. They were not carved in marble, but meant to live in the margins of history, constantly revised in the light of prayer, local custom, and urgent necessity. This is where it gets interesting. Unlike other orders with strict daily liturgies or hierarchical monastic routines, the Jesuit constitution was designed around one core idea: availability. A Jesuit should be able to go anywhere, do anything, teach mathematics, debate heresy, sail across oceans, counsel kings, or, just as often, scrub latrines in a plague house and remain unseen. But how do you govern such flexibility? That question is the heart of the Jesuit rulebook, and its answer is not what most expect. You don't govern it through control. You govern it through conscience. That's why, before taking any major decision, whether applying for a mission post, choosing a course of study, or even correcting a subordinate, the Jesuit is expected to pause, to reflect, to consider not just what is allowed, but what is helpful. This makes the rulebook strangely alive. Its pages are filled with clauses, like as it shall seem most expedient to the greater good, or unless there should appear to be greater advantage otherwise. In a world obsessed with certainty, the Jesuits quietly trained themselves to live with discernment instead. And yet, this quiet discernment was built on a spine of steel: obedience. You see, for all its adaptability, the Constitution holds one expectation that is both radical and uncompromising: that every Jesuit must obey the superior general, the so-called Black Pope, as though obeying the voice of Christ himself. Not metaphorically. Literally, this obedience is not blind, but it is total, and it's not born of fear. It is forged through a long, careful process of spiritual formation before a Jesuit is ever allowed to pronounce final vows. He undergoes years, sometimes decades, of education, service, silence, and spiritual testing. The final vow is not just poverty, chastity, and obedience. There is a 4th vow to go wherever the Pope sends him, without argument, without delay. This is where the Constitution becomes more than a rule book. It becomes a kind of internal compass, a way of training men not just to follow orders, but to become the kind of people who no longer need to be told. It was this blend of inner freedom and outward loyalty that made the Jesuits such powerful agents and such troubling ones. Wherever they went, they were both deeply obedient and profoundly unpredictable. In China, they studied Confucian ethics and translated them into Latin. In South America, they built entire autonomous communities for indigenous tribes. where European colonists were forbidden to enslave or exploit them. In Europe, they became confessors to monarchs, and sometimes it's their quiet opposition. The Constitution didn't tell them what to do in each place. It trained them how to think, how to choose, how to suffer, and how to endure. This spiritual elasticity was seen by some as genius, others as threat. By the 18th century, it was clear that Jesuits didn't just take orders, they shaped worlds through education, through diplomacy, through the power of interpretation that, for many rulers and bishops, was intolerable. And so, in 1773, Pope Clement XIV, under pressure from the kings of Spain, Portugal, France, suppressed the Society of Jesus entirely. You might assume that was the end of the story, but the Constitution had already accounted for it, hidden within its final pages. There's a quiet clause. If ever the society is abolished, the members shall not despair. They are to continue living the mission in spirit. They are to wait in hope. They are to serve in silence. And they did, for 41 years, across continents. Former Jesuits became gardeners, teachers, lighthouse keepers. But they kept the disciplines. They prayed the examen. They wrote letters in invisible ink. They studied astronomy. They helped the poor. They lived the Constitution without ever quoting it. In 1814, the order was restored by Pope Pius VII, and the Jesuits stepped quietly back into public life as if they had never left. Because, in a way, they hadn't. That's the true mystery of the Jesuit Constitution. It's not a book of rules. It's a way of remembering. It's remembering who you are when no one is watching. Some sections are dense, full of footnotes about educational methods, dietary routines, or whether books should be bound in leather or paper. Others are heartbreakingly intimate, like the instruction that a Jesuit should write weekly letters to his superior, not to report success, but to confess exhaustion, confusion, or spiritual dryness. No punctuation was required, only honesty, and perhaps the most powerful part. The Constitution ends not with a flourish of theology, but with a series of humble reminders to avoid idle talk, to listen more than you speak, to read scripture with your whole body, not just your mind, to leave a room cleaner than you found it. This is not the language of power-hungry agents. It is the language of servants. And yet, that's what made them so powerful, because in a world of noise, the Jesuits whispered in a church of spectacle. They studied. In an age of command, they obeyed, but only after thinking deeply. The Constitution gave them this strange freedom, to be entirely bound by something deeper than rules, by something closer to memory. So the next time you hear a rumor about secret Jesuit codes or clandestine plans, remember this. The real secret is written plainly. It's in their silence. It's in the way they clean their desks before leaving a room. It's in the way they close a book with two hands. It's in the Constitution, not hidden in a vault, but hidden in plain sight. You may think that to join an elite global order with connections in every continent and influence at the highest levels of church and state would require a dramatic ceremony, perhaps a secret handshake, a whispered oath in candlelight, or a scroll of ancient pledges. But to begin training as a Jesuit, you simply knock on the door of a house that doesn't announce itself. There is no trumpet. There is no sign. Society of Jesus receives its aspirants with quiet, practical hospitality. Someone gives you a blanket, a basin, a list of tasks, and then, for a long time, it's almost nothing, because the Constitution does not begin with power. It begins with poverty of spirit. The first step is called the novitiate, and it lasts 2 full years, not days, not months. It's entire years in which the candidate or novice lives under a strict rhythm of prayer, silence, labor, and self-reflection. There is no promise of entry, no guarantee of advancement. The novitiate is, in essence, a prolonged question. Can you live without clarity? Can you wait without praise? Can you serve without being seen? During these 2 years, the novice reads the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, not once, but as a daily map for the soul. This little book is not a theological treatise or a philosophical argument. It is, instead, a kind of internal audit, structured meditations, images, actions, designed to reveal a person's true motivations. And the exercises aren't done in comfort. Many are carried out in strict silence, often with simple meals and long hours of solitude. The goal is not punishment, it's pruning. You are gently, steadily removed from ego, reputation, ambition, so that what remains is something simpler. You begin to learn, as the Constitution says, that a Jesuit must learn to hear God, not just in scripture, but in interruptions, in fatigue, and in the voice of another. After the novitiate, and only if both the novice and his superiors agree that the call is genuine, a long and deliberately fragmented education begins. This is not a straight line. It is more like a spiral staircase. First, philosophy, then teaching, then theology, then, perhaps, exile, then theology again, then mission, then silence. Constitution requires that Jesuits become masters of adaptation, not just in skill, but in temperament. That's why they might spend years in vastly different environments. A Jesuit might teach grammar to children in Sicily one year, and then carry firewood in a Canadian village the next. He might be trained in Latin, but told to learn Urdu. He might be a brilliant preacher, but ordered to work in the archives. This is by design. Each stage of Jesuit formation is guided by one of the least glamorous concepts in church tradition: indifference, not emotional coldness, but holy detachment. The idea that a Jesuit must learn to desire neither health nor sickness, wealth nor poverty, fame nor obscurity, but only that which best serves the greater good. This isn't abstract. It's rehearsed in every assignment. In every choice, the Jesuit is asked not what he wants, but what the mission needs. And here is where the tree Constitution begins to take on its real shape. It is not a book of commands. It is a scaffold for interior freedom. Within its pages, there are guidelines on when to speak and when to remain silent, instructions on how to care for the sick without becoming sick in spirit, reminders that prayer should not be used as an escape from duty, nor should duty become a substitute for prayer. And most importantly, Constitution teaches how to obey. But this is not obedience as most imagine it. Jesuit obedience is not mechanical. It does not produce robots. In fact, the Superior General, the so-called Black, is warned explicitly in the Constitution never to use his authority to suppress the voice of conscience. He must never order a man to act against his discernment, nor to speak falsehood for the sake of convenience. Obedience in the Jesuit tradition means something deeper: the alignment of interior freedom with communal mission. It is why decisions often take time. A Jesuit does not simply receive orders. He discerns them through a back and forth of letters, conversations, and prayer. He listens not only to his superior's instructions, but also to his own interior resistance or openness. And the superior listens to guard his obedience as relationship. This is why Jesuit missions, from the earliest ones in Ethiopia and Japan to the modern postings in refugee camps and research centers, are never carbon copies. No two Jesuits carry the same tools, no to teach in the same way, and yet they are all bound by the same invisible thread. This thread becomes visible only in crisis, when Jesuits were arrested during the Reformation, or tortured during the Japanese crackdown of the 17th century, or assassinated in Central America in the 1980s. They did not resist violently. They did not flee. They did not seek martyrdom. They obeyed, not out of submission to the enemy, but out of consistency with the mission. The Constitution had trained them not for glory, but for steadiness. It is in the dry handwritten sections on letters, shoes, and study habits that you begin to see it most clearly. The document insists that every Jesuit write regular reports to his superior, not to boast of success, but to document failures, weaknesses, uncertainties. These letters, called manifestations of conscience, are not confessions, but updates of the soul. A Jesuit might report that he is lonely or restless, or that he feels drawn to a different line of service. The superior, in turn, writes back, not as a commander, but as a fellow discerned, offering reflection, advice, and sometimes silence. The Constitution does not demand uniformity. It demands honesty. There are rules for how to correct a brother, Jesuit gently, for how to rest on Sundays without sloth, for how to avoid the sin of becoming useful above humility. There is even a rule that no Jesuit should desire to become a bishop, because power, for all its use, is always a temptation. Most remarkable thing, these rules have barely changed since they were written in the 1550s. Despite wars, schisms, suppressions, exiles, and reforms, the Society of Jesus has returned again and again to the same Constitution. They've reprinted it, teached it, taught it to new generations, because it is not just a document, it is a rhythm of life, a slow, quiet formation of men who are not looking for status, but for steadiness. And this is perhaps why the Jesuits, despite their enormous influence, have remained elusive to the outside world. They do not explain themselves in simple slogans. They do not always wear distinct robes. Their schools, their missions, their publications, all reflect a kind of ordinary excellence. But beneath that ordinary exterior is something quite rare. A rule book designed not to control, but to liberate, to shape men who can walk into a room and notice everything, who can write speeches for presidents or clean the toilets after a flood, who can recite Aquinas in the morning and play soccer with street children by evening. The Constitution does not make heroes, it makes servants, which is why, when a Jesuit becomes Pope, as Jorge Mario Bergoglio did in 2013, he does not refer to himself as a Jesuit Pope. He simply chooses a name, Francis, and returns to the Constitution he has carried since novitiate: obedience, discernment, poverty, service, and the quiet confidence that rules when written with love. Do not bind, they free, they free. You may have heard the title, whispered in documentaries or fringe histories, The Black Pope. It sounds dramatic, shadowy, like the plot of a novel. And yet, the reality is far less cinematic and far more compelling. The Black Pope is not a secret rival to the white-robed pontiff in Rome. He is the superior general of the Society of Jesus. The title Black comes simply from the traditional black cassock worn by members of the Jesuit Order, and the term itself was once used more in irony than intrigue. But over time, as the Jesuits grew in global reach, some began to wonder. The Pope sets doctrine, who ensures its execution behind the scenes. The Superior General is not a monarch. He is elected by his peers. And once elected, he holds the position for life. There are no term limits, no regular transitions of power. Some generals serve decades, others only a few years. The one thing they share, they do not campaign. They do not seek the role. In fact, as dictated by the constitutions, anyone who appears too eager for authority is automatically disqualified from consideration. This is the paradox at the heart of Jesuit leadership. You are only qualified to lead if you do not desire it. When the time comes to elect a new superior general, the process is deliberately slow. Jesuits from around the world gather in a general congregation, but before any vote, they enter a period of what is known as murmuratio. For 4 days, all political discussion is suspended. No one may make a public case for any candidate. Instead, Jesuits approach one another in private, one by one, asking, "What have you seen? Who among us walks with humility? Who listens more than they speak?" The murmuring is not gossip. It is a form of communal discernment. When the vote is finally cast, it is done in silence. And once elected, the new general does not step forward onto a grand balcony. He does not hold a ceremony or give a speech. He prays. Then he begins reading letters, because already, in his absence, quests and crises from Jesuits around the world have begun arriving on his desk. This man will now oversee the lives and missions of thousands. He is not a king, but he is expected to think like a strategist. He must balance tradition with adaptation. He must assign people not based on convenience, but on a lifetime of quiet observation. And here is where the mystery deepens, because the real power of the Black Pope lies not in what he commands, but in what he understands. Over centuries, Jesuit generals have sat quietly while kings raged. Popes faltered and wars redrew countenance. The society has been suppressed by monarchies, expelled from entire nations, burned in effigy by those who feared their loyalty to Rome, and yet it has survived. Why? Because the Black Pope never leads from the front. He leads through structure, through a chain of formation so resilient, so internalized, that removing the top does not destroy the system. It simply delays its rhythm. Consider this. In 1773, Pope Clement XIV suppressed the Jesuit order entirely. Political pressure from European monarchs had grown unbearable, and the Jesuits, accused of being too powerful, secretive, were dissolved. Their schools closed, their properties seized, their missions abandoned, but no riots broke out. No one published a defense. Why? Because the Jesuits had already been trained to vanish well. They faded into other roles, some as priests under new names, others as secular teachers, others into complete silence. For 40 years, there was no official society of Jesus, and yet, when Pope Pius VII restored the order in 1814, the Jesuits returned with remarkable speed. Their rules had never been burned. Their formation had never been forgotten. The Constitution, preserved in hearts, in margins of books, in hidden letters, simply reawakened. This is the power of systems built on interior obedience. The Black Pope does not micromanage. He does not rule by decree. Instead, he sets tones. Tone is everything. One general may emphasize education, and suddenly, Jesuit universities begin appearing in new corners of the world. Another may stress social justice, and Jesuits begin embedding with refugees, fighting for labor rights, or studying economic inequality. These shifts are never announced. They are felt slowly, persistently across the network, because Jesuits are not required to follow fads. They are required to discern. There is a rule in the Constitution that the general should never burden the society with excess words. Long letters are discouraged. Lavish speeches, too. Instead, the general leads through example, brevity, and trust. And, because of this discretion, the Black Pope has at times been rumored to wield secret powers far beyond his office. There have been claims, mostly unsubstantiated, that Jesuits influenced revolutions, toppled regimes, infiltrated universities. But the truth is both simpler and more subtle. Jesuits, trained to listen before they act, often end up near the levers of influence, Not because they sought them, but because people sought them out. A Jesuit, the city center, might become a spiritual director for a diplomat. Jesuit professor might be asked to mediate between rival factions. A Jesuit, serving the poor, might witness injustices that no one else can name and quietly report them. This is not conspiracy. It is consequence. The Black Pope is not pulling strings behind the scenes. He is ensuring that those who serve do so without ego. That when influence arrives, as it often does, it is received with caution. You may find it surprising that even in the 21st century, when institutions everywhere are facing decline, the Jesuits remain among the most active Catholic orders. They run schools, universities, retreat centers, refugee ministries, science institutes, even astronomy observatories. They publish journals in multiple languages. They advise world leaders. They take vows of poverty, and still the Constitution governs them, a document written centuries ago in an age without electricity or global travel. And it remains unchanged, not because it is perfect, but because it does not pretend to be. It is, like the Jesuits themselves, unfinished by design. In recent years, even the title Black Pope has faded from common use. It feels outdated, misleading. The current general, Father Arturo Sosa, elected in 2016, is Venezuelan. He speaks gently, walks without an entourage, often reminds the world that the greatest authority is discernment in community. That is, the ability to listen together, to disagree without rupture, to wait until clarity arrives. He has said that his job is not to wield power, but to keep the fire burning, the quiet fire lit by Saint Ignatius more than 4 centuries ago. A fire that teaches men to surrender ambition, to think in decades, not moments, to lead without seeking to be followed. And so, the mystery of the Black Pope is perhaps no mystery at all. It is the mystery of invisible authority, of rules that produce freedom, of power that avoids the spotlight, and of a man who, though largely unknown outside the church, quietly influences the paths of those who shape it. The idea that Rome ruled with one voice, speaking orders from on high that echoed unchanged into the far corners of Christendom, is more myth than reality. In the imagination, the Pope writes, and all of Catholic Europe bends, but in the provinces, those distant, often overlooked dioceses, stretching from the hills of Bohemia to the parched fields of southern Italy, the truth moved slower. Often, it never moved at all to understand how papal orders were silenced, ignored, or quietly reinterpreted before reaching their destination. You must first understand how fragile communication was in a world of horses, wax, seals, and messengers, whose loyalties were not always to the parchment they carried. In the 13th and 14th centuries, the church was a tangle of overlapping jurisdictions. A bishop in a remote village might report to an archbishop hundreds of miles away, who himself answered to a cardinal with broader political concerns. Somewhere above them all sat the Pope, and while his seal carried spiritual authority, the reality of power lay with those who controlled ink and ink carriers on the ground. Letters, the most precious instruments of papal power, were often carried by foot, mule, or hired courier. They might pass through hostile towns, encounter storms, or simply fall into the hands of those with reasons not to deliver them. More than a few were lost at sea, destroyed by rain, or torn open by local officials who believed themselves more fit to interpret divine will than Rome itself. And yet, it wasn't always geography or weather that silenced papal directives. It was intention. Consider the case of Pope Boniface VIII, whose strong assertions of papal supremacy in the early 14th century triggered not only open defiance in France, but also quiet sabotage in places like Avignon and Naples. Bulls, formal declarations meant to assert Rome's control, were known to arrive weeks late or not at all. In some cases, cathedral scribes were ordered to copy the bulls incorrectly, asserting subtle word changes that would make obedience seem optional in other places. Letters were intercepted by local nobles who feared Rome's interference in their affairs. A papal order demanding the removal of a corrupt abbot, for instance, could threaten a carefully managed alliance between church and landholder. Rather than confront the Pope directly, a bold and dangerous move, the noble might simply ensure the messenger never arrived. If asked later why the Pope's instructions had not been followed, the response would be one of practiced confusion. We never received such a letter, and often Rome would have no way to prove otherwise. In the dusty archives of provincial monasteries, historians have uncovered scraps of these silenced messages, bulls with broken seals, letters hidden inside false bindings of other books, or carefully erased ink that suggests the content was read and then erased from official memory. One case stands out: the silencing of Pope Gregory XI's orders during the chaos leading to the Western Schism in the years before the papacy returned from Avignon to Rome in 1377. The church was teetering on the edge of fragmentation. Gregory issued letters demanding obedience to his chosen cardinals, especially in France and the Italian city-states. But those letters, once they passed beyond the Apennines, met a wall of selective silence. In Florence, the Medici-lined clergy received the letters but delayed their public reading until weeks had passed and local sentiment had hardened. When they were finally read, they were introduced not as commands, but as requests for consideration. The shift in language, so small, yet so deliberate, reduced papal authority to the level of suggestion. And once that line had been crossed, others followed suit. In Siena, a letter commanding the excommunication of a rebellious priest was opened, read, and then resealed with a new wax stamp bearing the bishop's own sigil. When it was eventually delivered, it appeared to carry a dual authority: Rome's and the local bishops. But the message had been rewritten. The original Latin phrase, anathema sit, let him be cursed, was softened to communiator, let him be warned. The priest remained in his position for 3 more years, even in England, where papal authority was generally more respected. Letters from Rome were often received with skepticism during the reign of King Edward III. Papal bulls attempting to regulate church appointments were met with a cold reception in Westminster. Parliament passed laws allowing the crown to override Rome's decisions in local ecclesiastical appointments. The Pope continued to send letters. The king continued to ignore them. What emerges from these forgotten patterns is a picture not of papal dominance, but of decentralized discretion, where the final interpretation of Rome's voice happened not in the Vatican, but in the chanceries, sacristies, and courtrooms of faraway lands. One bishop, upon receiving a letter instructing him to cease taxation of his local parishioners, reportedly called together his council and read the letter aloud. He turned to them and said, "Let us consider how best to interpret these words in the context of our particular circumstances." The letter was placed in a locked chest. The taxes continued. We imagine medieval Europe as a place where papal will was supreme. In reality, the church was a complex dance of interpretation. The letter was not the law. The reading of the letter was, and often that reading was shaped by local fears, ambitions, and a long memory of what happened when one obeyed too quickly. There is an old saying among canon lawyers: "Non omnis lyra est vox Dei." Not every letter is the voice of God. It was a warning and a loophole. So what did Rome do in the face of this persistent muting of its voice? It adapted. Future popes sent envoys instead of letters. Papal legates were dispatched with oral instructions that could not be intercepted or rewritten. But even then, these envoys faced bribes, threats, or imprisonment. Some were simply ignored, seated in the back of ceremonies without ever being acknowledged. Others were killed before they could speak in the quiet corridors of provincial churches. Power was measured not by distance from Rome, but by distance from obedience. To whom do you listen when the voice of Rome arrives in damaged ink, carried by a writer who looks unsure? To whom do you bow when one priest says anathema and another says consideration? In time, this slow erosion of papal control would lead to larger fractures: the Reformation, the rise of national churches, the shrinking of the Vatican's political sphere. But it began with smaller moments: a misread sentence, a missing wax seal, a bishop who looked at the Pope's letter and thought, "Not today." And as we examine the long arc of church history, we find that the true authority of Rome was not in the parchment it sent, but in whether those who received it were still listening. The further a letter traveled from Rome, the more vulnerable it became, not just to storms or robbers or broken seals, but to the quiet intervention of those who read it first. In cathedral scriptoria, behind heavy wooden doors, the scribes sat, educated, precise, and, more often than not, deeply embedded in the politics of their towns and dioceses. It was here, before the letter ever reached its intended audience, that the real editing began. You might picture these scribes as mere copyists, hunched over pages in silent devotion, but they were far more than transcribers. In many dioceses, the scribe was the right hand of the bishop or the archdeacon. He was trusted not just with ink, but with intent, and when a papal bull arrived, sealed in red wax, it often passed through the hands of the local scribe before anyone else saw it. And that's where it got interesting. Consider the case of Francesco della Porta, a 14th century Florentine scribe, known not for his calligraphy, which was excellent, but for his restraint. Francesco served under Bishop Paolo de' Medici, a man cautious of Rome's growing pressure to reform local taxation practices. When letters arrived ordering immediate changes to the diocesan ledger, they were first opened in Francesco's modest office. The bishop trusted his judgment. What Francesco did was not blatant forgery. He didn't rewrite the letters. He simply selected the parts to transcribe into the diocesan records. He omitted lines. He adjusted the sequence of commands. And when he read the letter aloud in the council chamber, he did so from his own transcription, not from the original. It was subtle. It was deniable. And it changed policy. When questioned by a visiting auditor, Francesco pointed to the copy in the church ledger and swore that was what had been received. He had no need to lie outright. The original had been quietly reshelved, misfiled under a different papal reign. By the time anyone thought to retrieve it, the ink had faded, and the seal had been accidentally broken. This was not a unique incident. In the archives of Burgos, northern Spain, scholars have found dozens of discrepancies between papal bulls recorded locally and the Vatican's own copies. Some changes are slight, a softened word here, a removed excommunication clause there. Others are substantial. Entire orders erased, phrases reordered to make rebukes sound like advice. Why? 'Cause in these places, the church was local before. It was Roman. The bishop had to walk the streets. The archdeacon had to eat in the same halls as the merchants he might be ordered to chastise. Rome could afford ideals. The provinces required pragmatism, and the scribes knew it. In Avignon, during the period of the Avignon papacy, papal bureaucracy flourished. Popes, surrounded by French influence, issued decrees intended to centralize power and extract revenue. But in Burgundy, local clergy feared a backlash from nobles who saw Rome as a foreign voice. Letters demanding the seizure of lands for papal taxation were read, rewritten, and diluted until they resembled vague appeals to cooperation. Sometimes they weren't read at all. There's a curious pattern in the episcopal registers of the period: blank spaces where a papal instruction should be. When questioned, the response was often that the letter had arrived illegible, water damage, smudged ink, a lost translation. Perhaps the courier didn't speak Latin well enough to interpret it, and once a letter was unreadable, it became negotiable. In Prague, during the reign of Charles IV, a papal command to remove a heretical preacher from a university post was intercepted by the university chancellor's office. The letter was indeed read, but never entered into official record. Instead, the chancellor wrote a reply to Rome, claiming the preacher had died. He had not. Continued lecturing for 7 more years. The Vatican responded with silence. Whether they believed the reply or simply chose not to escalate, we cannot say. But this pattern repeats. Rome sends, reply returns, and the content between the two often fails to match. Even more elaborate were the pseudo-bulls letters forged in the style of real papal documents, crafted not to defy Rome, but to simulate its agreement. These were sometimes created by scribes, under pressure from local rulers who wanted the legitimacy of papal approval without the hassle of waiting months for a real response. A notable example comes from Lombardy, where a forged papal bull was presented to justify the construction of a new chapel in lands disputed between two abbeys. The bull, later examined under better light, revealed inconsistencies in the seal and a phrase structure that Rome had ceased using a generation earlier. But by then, the chapel had been built. Pilgrims were arriving. To undo the document would mean unraveling months of pious donations and political alliances. So the bishop declared the matter resolved and moved on. What does all this tell us? It's that power in the church was not just a matter of issuing decrees. It was a matter of controlling the paper, the ink, and the voices that read it. And those voices, in many cases, were not in Rome. They were in Bordeaux, where the bishop's clerk delayed the announcement of a papal excommunication until the excommunicated noble had left town. They were in Mainz, where a papal order to suppress a local festival was paraphrased in such a way that the festival continued, just under a new name. They were in Syracuse, where a letter banning certain indulgences was copied with a missing clause, allowing their quiet sale to continue through a local loophole. And always, there were the archives, where letters might be hidden in unrelated volumes, where papal orders could be bound between pages of agricultural records, ensuring no one would ever casually flip to them, where ink faded and marginalia bloomed over one's clear instructions. What emerges is not a story of rebellion. It is a story of discretion, of how the church adapted to local conditions without openly challenging its center. A story of how a scribe with a firm hand could balance doctrine and diplomacy, faith and flexibility, and this quiet tradition, this subtle reshaping of power through pen and parchment, did not end in the Middle Ages, even in the early modern period. During the Council of Trent and beyond, papal instructions were filtered through local lenses. Bishops received orders with caveats. Observe these provisions as best suits the disposition of your faithful, or implement these measures with due regard for the custom of your diocese. In other words, we are the voice of God, but you must decide how to listen. So, when we ask how papal authority weakened or how the Vatican lost its grip on the provinces, we must not imagine great revolts or dramatic breakaways. We must imagine small rooms, inkpots, a pair of tired eyes squinting over Latin lines, and a decision made in silence to copy the letter as it was, or to pause and rewrite and rewrite. When a letter vanished in medieval Europe, it didn't vanish like a raindrop absorbed by the earth. It left behind clues, faint smudges of wax in a diocesan register, a curious absence in an otherwise methodical record book, a whisper of quat, a command that the locals knew but never heard officially read aloud, and yet no one ever seemed to go looking. That silence was not accidental in the quiet governance of the church's vast provinces. Silence became a tool, not of rebellion, but of containment, and long after the scribes folded their last letter and bishops passed from one crosier to another, this culture of selective memory, of rewriting, its filing, and occasionally losing the voice of Rome became part of how the church held itself together without ever showing its cracks. Let us revisit the dusty archives of Toledo, where 16th century bishops began to formalize how papal letters were handled. A registry book from 1542 reveals a detailed index of bulls and papal commands, but also includes a second index, quietly labeled advisory items, a strange category filled with documents that should have held equal or greater weight, yet were deliberately categorized away from the main chain of command in one entry. We read of a papal order demanding the closure of a small monastery accused of doctrinal deviation. The local bishop's reply was polite, deferential, and vague. He noted that he would commence a review. That was the last mention of it, as the monastery records show, remained open for another 60 years. Why didn't anyone from Rome follow up? Because Rome, too, had learned a kind of silence. The Curia, the vast bureaucracy surrounding the Pope, was never as all-knowing as some imagined. Communications were slow, regional reports sporadic, and often filtered through intermediaries with their own loyalties. By the time a question returned to Rome, if it returned at all, the original issue had often resolved itself. A troublesome bishop had died. A new one had been appointed. A war had begun. A plague had shifted local priorities. Thus, noncompliance was absorbed, not through confrontation, but through time. There are letters, hundreds, still stored in the Archivio Segreto Vaticano, the secret archives, that were never responded to, never enforced, and never followed up. Some were ignored by the provinces. Others, one suspects, were quietly forgotten by Rome itself. Take the case of the Bishop of Lucca, who in the early 1500s was accused of harboring heretical texts in his private collection. A papal order commanded him to submit his personal library to a commission of cardinals. The bishop replied that the roads were flooded and that travel to Rome might jeopardize the health of my archivists. No books were ever sent. The commission disbanded the following year. The matter was closed, but something more subtle occurred here. The bishop's original refusal, framed as concern for his staff's health, created a template for ecclesiastical evasion. Throughout central Italy, bishops began replying to Rome with similar phrases. Circumstances prevent immediate obedience, or local unrest makes execution of your orders temporarily unwise. These weren't lies. They were phrases of suspension, ways to obey without acting. We see this echoed centuries later in Latin American dioceses under colonial rule. Bishops in Peru and Mexico received instructions to suppress indigenous traditions, more aggressively to demolish syncretic shrines, to replace local saints' festivals with European feast days. But again and again, bishops sent back letters saying the same thing. Such reforms must come slowly, lest they incite rebellion. These bishops weren't defending native culture, not openly, but they understood something that Rome didn't. Governance in the provinces was a balancing act. The letter from the Vatican was just one part of it. There were also the merchants, the nobles, the local militia, the people who lit the candles and filled the pews, and above all, there was time. Rome's command might take 2 months to arrive. Its reply to a bishop's delay might take another 3. In those months, entire seasons passed, lives shifted, and the urgency of the original command faded like ink left in the sun. Even when letters were obeyed, they often became symbols rather than instruments. In Salzburg, papal edict ordered the exhumation of a local mystic whose writings had been declared suspicious. The bishop complied. The body was removed from the public crypt as ordered, but rather than bury it in obscurity, he placed it in a private chapel on the church grounds. Quietly continued to reprint her writings, now prefaced with a disclaimer. The edict had been obeyed in form, but its spirit was not only sidestepped, it was recontextualized. Such strategies only grew more refined with the emergence of concordats, formal agreements between Rome and national governments. By the 17th century, papal letters had to be filtered through not just bishops, but also kings, emperors, and state-appointed committees. Each layer added time, distance, and reinterpretation. The Austrian Empire, under Joseph II, developed a remarkable system. Papal documents could not be read publicly or enacted until they were approved by the state's ecclesiastical authority, a body loyal not to Rome, but to Vienna. This policy, known as Josephinism, meant that entire papal bulls could be shelved indefinitely. Some were held for years without acknowledgement. Others were quietly edited, reissued in the emperor's name, and distributed as if they were local decrees. Thus, A letter could be both received and denied at the same time, a strange kind of political Schrödinger's cat. In the New World, the process was even more delayed. A bull issued in 1612 demanding stricter confession rules for priests in the colonies took 11 years to reach the Diocese of Lima. By that time, a new pope had been elected, the bishop had died, and no one remembered the issue. What emerges from all this is not a picture of defiance, but of transformation. The letter from Rome, once a symbol of direct, divine will, became part of a slow-moving dialogue, one influenced by terrain, illness, climate, literacy, local alliances, above all, memory, and that memory could be shaped. Letters were copied, annotated, sometimes translated into the vernacular, a process that inevitably introduced bias. A Latin word for must might become should. A phrase expressing divine displeasure might be softened into mild concern. More dramatically, there are examples of interrupted letters, bulls, where one sheet arrived, but not the other, or where the courier confessed, under duress or coin, to having discarded part of the letter because it caused offense. In Naples, an apocryphal tale survives of a courier who, upon reading the letter he carried, tore out a paragraph condemning the local archbishop and claimed the horse had eaten it during a rest stop. Whether true or not, the story reflects the fragile and manipulable nature of authority carried by paper. So what does all this mean for us now? It means that when we look at church history, we cannot judge it solely by its proclamations. The real story lies in the gaps, in what was sent but not seen, written but not heard, read but not believed. It lies in the whisper of vellum against wood as a letter was filed, not in the urgent pile, but in the later drawer. It lies in the ink that dried slowly in the hand of a scribe who paused, dipped his quill again, decided to end the sentence differently. And it lies in us, in our own selective memories, our own reshaping of the past, our own silent decisions to hear some truths and not others. So perhaps the Vatican never needed to erase history. Perhaps it only needed to wait, let the world forget what it had already written. Hidden deep within the corridors of the Apostolic Palace, among winding staircases and locked wooden doors older than most modern nations, there is said to be a room that does not appear on any blueprint, not on official plans, not in registry logs, not even in the archival schematics available to trusted Vatican archivists. It is not a cell, not a chapel, not a crypt, and yet, for over 3 centuries, whispers of it have echoed through the ranks of those who serve under the Holy See. They call it the chamber with no door. The name itself sounds theatrical, tasked, but those who speak of it rarely smile. Tid is mentioned, quietly, almost reluctantly, often late at night, in seminaries or under frescoed ceilings, during long, quiet pauses in theological debates. The Jesuits, members of the Society of Jesus, do not deny its existence, but they do not confirm it either. If you ask, they might say, there are many rooms in the Vatican. Some are not meant for everyone, and then they change the subject to understand this alleged room. You have to first understand the strange power of Jesuit secrecy, founded in 1540 by Ignatius of Loyola. The Society of Jesus was never just a religious order. It used intellectual discipline with rigorous loyalty, part seminary, part military unit, part global think tank. Jesuits were not just missionaries and scholars. They were observers, educators, advisors to kings, and, above all, they were strategists. They did not wield armies. They wielded knowledge. They mapped local languages before colonizers arrived. They taught astronomy in imperial courts in China. They helped define the very boundaries of conscience in Catholic doctrine. So when rumors began to circulate in the 1600s that there was a room in the Vatican meant only for high-ranking Jesuits, a room with no public record, no visible entrance, and no confirmed function, It didn't seem impossible. It seemed likely. One of the first documented mentions comes from a now obscure Italian bishop named Giacomo Celestri, who, in a 1689 letter to a French cardinal, wrote the following line: "There is a chamber above the North Library, walled on all sides, with no declared access. It is said that certain brothers of the Society of Jesus enter it, but none have seen how." This reference was buried in a paragraph otherwise about architectural repairs, and likely would have been ignored if not for its haunting precision. A sealed room, never observed, yet occasionally visited. Other references trickled in over the next 100 years, mostly from disgruntled or excommunicated clergy who had reason to distrust Jesuit influence. A French priest, Father Renard Dulac, wrote in 1732, "They go into that room with manuscripts, and they leave without them. But no door is seen. I once followed at a distance. I heard no sound but a long, slow bolt being drawn, though I stood in an empty hallway." Of course, skeptics dismissed these stories. They cited the tendency for cloistered environments to attract superstition. In a city of secrets, every missing corridor could become a conspiracy. But here is where it becomes more than just shadowed hearsay. In 1814, when Pope Pius VII formally reinstated the Jesuit Order after its 41-year suppression, the official document, the bull Sollicitudo Omnium Ecclesiarum, was accompanied by a flurry of internal letters. One letter, preserved in the Vatican Library under restricted access, discusses the return of Jesuit property and the need to resecure room 235Bs. There is no room 235Bs on the public floor plan. There never was. What was room 235Bs? Why the suffix "bis"? A Latin indicator often used for hidden or secondary classifications. Okay. And why did this designation only appear in documents that referenced Jesuit activity? Architects familiar with Vatican renovations in the 19th century noted that during the Jesuit reinstatement, workers were briefly stationed in the northwest wing, specifically the old section adjacent to the Borgia apartments, which was undergoing restorative painting at the time. Those apartments, once used by the controversial Pope Alexander VI, contained rooms long believed to have secret passageways and movable walls. Some sections were never fully mapped, and others were deemed unusable and sealed behind stone. And yet, reports from the same year curiously show a shipment of 12 wooden chests labeled, i.e. SU, internal use, only being brought into that same area. 12 chests. No official explanation. No records of what they contained. Later in the century, in 1872, an Austrian nobleman turned priest named Father Karl von Eberstein published a tract critical of Jesuit secrecy, titled "Behind the Vatican Veil." He claimed, "There is a vault whose location is unknown to all but a triad of the highest Jesuit fathers. There they keep the dangerous materials, not heresies, but counter-heresies, ideas that are not false, but too dangerous for public release, truths that could unsettle obedience." He offered no proof, but the phrasing stuck. What could be so dangerous that even the Vatican would hide it from itself? Some speculated the room contained suppressed theological texts, early writings on church governance, perhaps suggesting that papal infallibility had internal challengers. Others whispered of maps, documents from early Jesuit missions in Asia and the Americas that revealed political alliances, hidden conversions, or lost churches. The most persistent rumor was that the room contained the Codex Petatus, a mythical Jesuit manuscript said to challenge foundational teachings about hierarchy, salvation, or authority. No copy of the Codex has ever surfaced, but its name appears faintly, marginally, in 3 separate 18th century inventories of confiscated books. Each time it was crossed out. Each time the margin read, "Internal, do not process." In more recent years, attention returned to the myth during the Second Vatican Council, 1962 to 1965. as reforms swept through Catholic doctrine, altering liturgy, interfaith relations, the role of laity. Some conservative clergy feared Jesuit overreach. One cardinal reportedly said, they no longer need to guard the room. They've let its contents out into the world. Was this metaphor? Or was he speaking literally? Even today, if you ask certain Vatican guards or longtime clerks, they might give you a non-answer. There are places not meant for us, and there are keys no one wants to carry, but keys imply doors. In this chamber, this room that does not appear on any map, is known precisely for having no door. So, how is it accessed? Some believe it is entered through an existing room, one with a false wall or a concealed staircase. Others think the chamber lies above or beneath another space, reachable only by narrow stone steps, queege behind a sealed panel. There's even a theory that it is accessible only during certain rituals, a Jesuit-only liturgy that takes place once a year in total silence, under the guise of private confession. There is no evidence for any of this, but the silence around the chamber seems curated, a silence as deliberate as the Jesuits' famous fourth vow, which they promise absolute loyalty to the Pope, even if it contradicts local custom or conscience. And perhaps that's the real answer. Perhaps the chamber with no door is not a room at all. Perhaps it is a metaphor for something more powerful, the ability to store secrets without needing a key or a lock, to know something and never speak it, to guard a truth by never acknowledging it, to bury an idea in plain sight, trusting that the world will walk past it without noticing. In that sense, maybe the chamber exists in every Jesuit heart, a private vault of what must not be said, what cannot be proven, what should never be burned, because it was never written down to begin with. But then again, what if it is real? What if one night, while walking the quiet halls of the Vatican, past locked doors and painted ceilings, you heard the sound of wood moving against stone? What if a corridor turned, and where there was once a blank wall, there was not? Would you enter? Would you want to know? Or would you, like the Jesuits, prefer to remember that the most secure room is not the one with the strongest lock, but the one no one believes is there? Let's return, slowly now, to the space that was never meant to exist. If the chamber does lie behind those aging walls, if it truly sits in silence above the Borgia apartments or beneath the marble footfalls of tourists who unknowingly walk its ceiling, then the better question is not where it is, but why it is. And to answer that, one must look not with suspicion, but with quiet historical patience. One must sit within the psychology of the Society of Jesus, their rules, their fears, their long-guarded distinctions between knowledge and danger, because the Jesuits were never merely hiding from the world. They were shielding the world from something they believed it wasn't ready to hold. Let's begin with a subtle but often overlooked fact. Jesuits have always been interested in paradox. In 1596, a little-known Jesuit theologian named Francisco Suarez wrote, "It is the burden of the society to walk at the edge of contradiction. We obey while questioning. We teach while doubting. We submit while thinking." This wasn't heresy. It was design. Jesuits were trained to argue both sides of a theological debate, not to confuse, but to understand. Their spiritual exercises asked them to imagine the devil's logic as well as God's mercy. They debated ideas they did not personally accept in the service of truth-seeking. So, if anyone in the church were to come across a forbidden idea, a strange manuscript, or a theory that challenged canon law, it would not be burned immediately. It would be considered, perhaps even copied, translated, debated, stored. That is Jesuit tradition. Now imagine the kind of texts that might have arrived in Rome over the centuries through Jesuit hands. The Society's missions extended to Japan, China, Ethiopia, the Americas, Persia, lands where theology, science, and cosmology followed very different logics. And unlike other missionaries, Jesuits often engaged these local scholars, not as superior messengers, but as humble students. In China, for instance, Jesuits worked closely with Confucian philosophers. They translated the I Ching. They debated cosmological order. One Jesuit, Matteo Ricci, even wrote, "Perhaps the ancients here reached truth by a road we do not yet understand." Such a statement would have sounded dangerous in Rome.org. Think of Roberto di Nobili in India, who dressed as a Brahmin and studied Sanskrit so he could learn Hindu metaphysics from within the caste system. What did he send back? We know the Jesuits were required to write reports called annual letters, detailed descriptions of the cultures they encountered. Some were edited and published. Others disappeared. Might they be in the room? What if there are alternate theological models quietly preserved? Writings that suggest that salvation was interpreted differently elsewhere, not in defiance of Christianity, but in genuine parallel. Could these texts have included lost books once rejected as apocryphal? Could the Jesuits have quietly archived letters from early Eastern churches? Or Gnostic writings, too dangerous to declare, but too compelling to destroy? There's a theory, rarely spoken aloud, that the room might contain pre-Christian histories, oral traditions, recorded by Jesuits in Africa or South America, that hinted at spiritual systems uncannily close to early Jewish or Christian doctrine. Not identical, but similar enough to raise questions about divine revelation, cultural transmission, and whether truth emerges once or many times across the human story. Such questions cannot be answered in sermons. They need shelves, quiet ones. We must also consider the Jesuits' role in scientific history. In 1611, the Jesuits accepted Galileo Galilei into their Collegio Romano to lecture on Jupiter's moons. They did not oppose his findings, not at first. Some of them replicated his observations. But over time, as Galileo's theories began to contradict church cosmology, pressure mounted. Jesuits backed away. Still, some privately maintained interest in heliocentrism, and Jesuit astronomers like Christoph Scheiner quietly explored sunspot activity. Could the chamber contain Jesuit research journals? Early acceptance of ideas that would later become standard science, but which the Vatican couldn't endorse publicly in the 17th century. Perhaps even conflicting theological conclusions reached through scientific means, such as whether the age of the universe, the fossil record, or ancient civilizations posed challenges to biblical chronology. Imagine a single manuscript, dated, containing detailed astronomical observations, ones that suggest a cosmology incompatible with Genesis. Not a heresy, but a historical question. What would the church do with such a text? Burn it, or store it quietly in a room with no name? There's also a more political layer. During the suppression of the Jesuits in the late 18th century, when monarchs across Europe pressured the Pope to dissolve the order, the Jesuits became masters of concealment. Their libraries were scattered. Some fathers went underground. Others joined other orders in name only, continuing their work in secret. When Pope Clement XIV finally suppressed the order in 1773, many Jesuit archives vanished. But when the order was restored in 1814, some of those documents reappeared in Rome selectively. It is possible that during those years, Jesuit loyalists hid not only books and records, but internal constitutions, correspondence, even codes that governed the movement's inner workings. What if the chamber holds those things, the rules behind the rules? There are whispers of a Jesuit codex, passed orally and occasionally recorded in cipher, one that outlines how the society can remain obedient to the Pope while simultaneously preserving autonomy. Such a document would not be treasonous, but it would be sensitive, dangerous in the wrong hands. A reminder that power in the church is rarely singular. It is layered, shared, contested. The church's outer doctrine is made of marble and creed, but the inner gears may run on parchment, ink, and silence. Now consider one final theory, a quiet one. It is said that some documents in the church are not kept because they are false, but because they are true, and would disorient the faithful if revealed. Not because they destroy doctrine, but because they complicate the simplicity on which belief depends. What if the chamber holds those truths? Letters from saints who doubted, testimonies from mystics whose visions included strange elements, stars falling, named figures, voices outside of scriptural tradition. One persistent rumor tells of a letter, tedema from a 15th century monk who claimed to have discovered a fragment of an earlier gospel, not heretical, not Gnostic, but merely unfamiliar, a version of the Beatitudes with additional lines, a suggestion of parables that did not make it into Matthew or Luke. The letter was dismissed. The monk was ignored. But the Jesuit who collected it, so the story goes, did not burn it. He stored it somewhere, and that somewhere, could it be the chamber, the room with no name, the shelf that cannot be cited, the lock that requires no key, because belief in its existence is itself the only keyhole. Perhaps that is the quiet brilliance of such a room. It protects not only secrets, but the space where secrets go. The institutional mind's version of a deep breath, a place to rest what cannot be solved, what must not be debated in public, but which remains real, flickering, persistent. It is not a vault for conspiracy. It is a vault for too much truth. And perhaps that is why Jesuits, with their paradoxical oaths, or deranged silences, their intellectual rigor, are the ones who guard it, because they alone are trained to carry truth that can't be used, only honored from a distance. But even in this reverent preservation, one must ask, has anything ever left the chamber? Has an idea, a page, a letter, a story ever crossed that invisible threshold and entered the wider world? If you've stayed with the story this long, then you've likely begun to feel it. That strange warmth that comes, not from revelation, but from the closeness of mystery. That sensation that perhaps the most guarded secrets are not hidden by locks or keys or security guards, but by our willingness to stop asking just before we reach the final question. But the church has always known something deeper than that. A secret does not need to be kept from the world if the world never learns to ask the right question. And yet, the question keeps being asked over centuries, generation after generation. Whispers of the Jesuits' hidden room, this chamber with no door, have refused to die. They show up in places you wouldn't expect. In the diaries of low-ranking scholars, in passing remarks by disillusioned cardinals, even in footnotes that seem to say one thing but suggest another. Let's follow one such trail. In 1903, a Jesuit-trained German archivist named Dr. Emil Weisch was assigned to catalog Latin manuscripts stored in an annex of the Vatican library. His job was not glamorous. It mostly involved matching faded numbers to handwritten logs, identifying duplicate entries, and flagging damaged pages. But in a private journal, now stored in a university in Bonn, Weisch noted a peculiar pattern. There were entire sections of the logbook where call numbers jumped without explanation. For example, entry 3420 might be followed by entry 3423 with no mention of what became of 3421 or 3422. Now, books do go missing. Pages decay. Scribes make errors. But what puzzled Weisch was that these missing entries were always surrounded by extremely delicate subjects: Eastern mysticism, Jewish Kabbalah, early church debates on original sin, or even critiques of papal infallibility, written before the doctrine had been formally established. More interesting still, several of these missing numbers showed up again years later, marked not as missing, but as reserved. Reserved for whom? The phrase used was ad consultandum, intras societam, for consultation within the society. That is, the Jesuits. Now, this phrase didn't prove a secret chamber, but it did suggest a protocol, a method by which certain materials, flagged as theologically or politically sensitive, were redirected away from the general library and into a Jesuit-only pathway of study and preservation. Could these items have been stored in a room? Could they have left paper trails, but no footprints? Weiss never found the manuscripts themselves, but he did something else. He mapped the pattern of the gaps and overlaid them on the physical structure of the library. He noticed that certain numbers always seemed to disappear within a particular spatial zone, the northwest quadrant, near an older wall that had long been sealed and repainted during Pope Pius IX's renovations. In his journal, Weiss wrote, "It is not that the books are hidden. It is that the logic which governs their presence has been diverted inward, not outward." The journal was never published. Weiss died in 1916, and his papers sat, unread, in storage until a theology student stumbled across them in the 1980s. By then, the room he had suggested, the quiet void inside the catalog system, had already become a kind of legend among those who cared enough to look. But what if the legend itself was a tool? Let's return briefly to how secrets are maintained, not just in vaults, but in minds. Jesuits are trained not only in theology and languages, but in discretion. Their intellectual exercises involve an almost monastic humility, where the question is not what do I know, but what ought to be shared. So, if there truly is a room, perhaps it is not physically locked. Perhaps it is protected by something more powerful than iron or code, consensus, a decision made long ago and passed silently down, that some truths must only live in conversation, never on display, that some books may be read but not cited, that some margins may contain annotations that were never intended for history, and perhaps, most chilling of all, that some answers are too heavy to carry outside sacred walls, but still, fragments leaked in the early 20th century. A Jesuit priest named Father McAuliffe delivered lectures in Malta about the undocumented influences on Catholic liturgy. He referenced ancient Syrian texts, not in the church's main catalog, but written in a marginal script that no one else had recorded. When asked for his sources, he simply said, "They are in the place where old things rest, but not all are asleep." The Vatican made no comment. The lecture stopped, and McAuliffe was reassigned. Years later, another Jesuit father, Renzo Tadei, gave a seminar in Buenos Aires, referencing a tabula, a kind of old Latin index that he claimed mapped the alternative inheritance of the early church. When students pressed for clarification, he replied with a phrase now passed quietly among insiders: "Noli intrare nisi vocatus." Do not enter unless called. What does it mean to be called into knowledge? Does it mean permission? Oh, responsibility. Perhaps both, because some knowledge, especially within the church, is not forbidden in order to control, but in order to protect. It's not to keep the people powerless, but to keep them from being overwhelmed. This brings us back to a deeper question. What exactly is inside the chamber, if it exists? It's not treasure, not scandal, but something more destabilizing. Context. Context that reframes doctrines not as single-line truths, but as centuries-long debates. Context that reveals how belief evolves, not always cleanly, sometimes contradictorily. Context that turns certainty into dialogue, doctrine into possibility. There are rumors, quiet ones, that the chamber contains letters written by early popes in times of deep uncertainty, not encyclicals, but private reflections, where popes admitted to doubt, to confusion, even to fear. What would such letters mean for the faithful? Perhaps nothing, perhaps everything. And then there are the Jesuits' own records of missions, of miracles, moments when they encountered peoples whose faith could not be reduced to error, whose prayers bore marks of something deeply, unsettlingly familiar. Some have speculated the chamber holds an index of convergences, cases where non-Christian systems of belief mirrored Christian truths in eerie symmetry. not as threats, but as questions. How do we account for shared, sacred logic across cultures? Do we call it coincidence, or revelation, refracted through geography? And then, quietest of all, are the rumors of a codex of silence. Not a book that tells a secret, but one that explains why some secrets are never told. This codex, if it exists, is said to outline how the society decides what to hide, not just from the world, but from the future. It suggests that the church, at its most inward-facing, has always wrestled with one terrible, compassionate question. How much truth can the faithful bear before the shape of faith itself begins to tremble? That is the question the chamber holds. It is not a vault, it is a whisper, a shadow cast by belief itself. A silence so carefully kept that its very existence may be a kind of sacrament, and as long as it remains unspoken, as long as the door stays invisible, the catalog incomplete, the shelf unnamed, then perhaps it serves its function. It reminds us that the church is not only built of stone and ritual, but also of discretion. That the past is not only what happened, but what we have chosen, generation after generation, to remember and to hide. And that somewhere in a corridor, too narrow to notice, behind a wall that blends too well to question, there may still be a space where the hardest questions are left unanswered. Not because the answers are false, but because, even now, we are not yet ready. There are few things more misunderstood in history than a whispered promise, especially when that promise is spoken beneath the crucifix in a candlelit room, with no one present but the initiate and a man in black robes who says nothing until it is time to begin. The Jesuit vow, or, more precisely, the final vow, has long been a source of mystery, myth, and misinterpretation. Conspiracy theorists have written books about it. Monarchs have banned it. Italian nations have once feared it more than any weapon. But the vow itself is not written in code. It's not sealed with blood. It's not even secret. You can find versions of it in Latin, Spanish, French, and Italian, all officially sanctioned by the Society of Jesus and the Vatican. Its words are theological, yes, and deeply layered, but they are, on paper, exactly what you'd expect from a man preparing to serve God with total obedience, humility, poverty, chastity, and a commitment to follow wherever he is sent. So why the mystery? To answer that, we must take a step back, not just from the wording of the vow, but from the way it is prepared for, spoken, and most importantly, remembered, because the Jesuit oath isn't just something you say, it's something you become. Let's begin, not in a chapel, but in a corridor, a long one, narrow, stone-floored, echoing softly with each step of the man walking through it. His robe is plain, his breath steady, his heart, perhaps, less so. He has studied for 15 years. He has taught in schools, preached in towns, served quietly in cities where no one knew his name. He has already taken 3 vows: poverty, chastity, and obedience, just to get to this point. But now, something else is about to happen. This is what the society calls the 4th vow. It is a pledge of special obedience to the Pope, specifically regarding missions. It binds the Jesuit not only to the rule of the order, but to be a ready instrument of papal will to go wherever he is sent, without hesitation. And that is precisely where the confusion begins. Because in a world of hidden rooms, secret missions, and church politics, what does it really mean to obey the Pope without question? Over the centuries, critics have painted this vow as something sinister. They have accused Jesuits of swearing undying loyalty, not just to the church, but to shadowy aims, political manipulation, clandestine operations, even assassination. These claims have taken many forms. Elizabethan England feared Jesuits as papal spies. Enlightenment thinkers mocked them as intellectual thugs. 19th century France accused them of poisoning republics with absolutist doctrine. But to the Jesuits themselves, The vow is not about control. It's about surrender. To understand that, we need to look closer at how a Jesuit even arrives at the moment of taking this final step. Unlike other religious orders, the Jesuits do not rush their formation. A typical path takes between 10 and 17 years. The novice period, which lasts 2 years, is followed by first vows. Then come years of study, ministry, regency, a time of teaching or mission work, more theology, and finally, for a very few, tertianship. The final stage, before the solemn profession. Tertianship is not a retreat. It's a kind of spiritual boot camp. Men in their 30s and 40s, already experienced, are asked to live again like novices, to strip away what they have learned and return to simplicity. It is during this time that they prepare for the final vows. It is not assumed they will take them. Only those found fully suited in character, mind, and heart are invited. Even among them, only a portion are called to the fourth vow. This distinction is important. The Jesuit fourth vow is not automatic. It is reserved for those being sent into a special kind of mission, one of absolute mobility, where loyalty to the Holy See supersedes all else. Historically, this meant global travel, secret assignments, and total readiness to serve in war zones, heretical regions, or courts where politics and theology collided. But not all Jesuits take it. Some live out their lives in universities or parishes, quietly brilliant, never needing to swear that extra layer of obedience. And for those who do, the day of the vow is slow, silent. They walk often alone into a chapel or oratory there. The presence of a crucifix, they kneel. They recite the words, not in haste, not in fear, but in absolute stillness. The formula includes phrases like, I promise, special obedience to the sovereign pontiff in regard to the missions, according to the same apostolic letters and the constitutions, and I promise to enter the society of Jesus, understanding all the pains and discomforts that may follow. There is no applause, no ceremony beyond the presence of God and one or two witnesses. Sometimes the superior general is present. Sometimes only a few other Jesuits, heads bowed in prayer. What happens next? The man rises, and he is now in full a Jesuit of the professed. He receives no new title, no robes, no medals, no elevation in rank, but his life is no longer his own. In that moment, he has made himself available. That word available is repeated often in Jesuit vocabulary. Available to the Pope, available to the needs of the Church, available to be misunderstood, misquoted, mischaracterized, all without defense. This is where the mystery deepens, because outside the Church, few understand what it means to be invisible in the service of a mission. Jesuits were never meant to be cloistered monks. They were meant to be mobile teachers, diplomats, confessors, astronomers, architects, linguists, and because they could appear in so many places, wearing so many guises, the world began to assume they must be everywhere, and where there is ubiquity, suspicion often follows. One example, in 1614, in Japan, the shogunate ordered the arrest and execution of Jesuit missionaries. Why? Not because they had committed crimes, but because their presence was too quiet, their impact too deep, their loyalties too unclear. In France, a century later, Jesuits were expelled for being both too Catholic and not Catholic enough. In Russia, they were welcomed when the Church banned them. In China, they translated Confucius before Europe even knew how to pronounce the name, always. They were obeying their vow to go where they were sent. But this obedience, this vow beneath the crucifix, has always walked a razor's edge between holiness and suspicion. Because what happens when obedience leads you into contradiction? What if the Pope commands something unjust? What if the mission is unclear? What if your vow becomes a burden, not just of action, but of silence? This is where the vow becomes misunderstood, even within the Church, because it is not just about missions. It is about relinquishing your right to choose. Not blindly, not foolishly, but in a spirit that says, I will go, I will serve, I will not be the author of my own destiny. Okay? And that, in a world driven by self-assertion, is perhaps the strangest vow of all. In the next section, we'll explore what happened when this vow collided with revolutions, inquisitions, and empires, and how Jesuits sometimes paid the price for loyalty no one else could understand. The 18th century did not begin gently for the Society of Jesus, as revolutions quietly germinated in the corners of salons, monasteries, and royal courts. The Jesuits, though neither king nor country, found themselves seated at the tables of power and suspicion. They were educators, advisors, missionaries, mathematicians, translators, and confessional guides to emperors and queens. But none of these roles shielded them when the tides began to shift by the mid-1700s. The vow that had once quietly guided their missions was now held up like a mirror, reflecting everything their enemies wanted to believe about them. It was a vow that demanded obedience. Yes, but to whom? And at what cost? In France, the political class had begun to view Jesuits as dangerously loyal to Rome at a time when loyalty to the crown was the only currency that mattered. In Portugal, a single failed assassination attempt on King Joseph I in 1758, one which had no clear connection to the Jesuits, was enough to justify their expulsion. The Marquis of Pombal, the king's powerful minister, seized the moment. He accused the Jesuits of secret plotting, economic manipulation, and clandestine interference in colonial trade. His decree came swiftly. Jesuits were arrested, their schools closed, their property confiscated, and they were banished from Portuguese territory, including Brazil, where they had spent generations building peaceful missions among indigenous communities. No trial, no open testimony, just suspicion, sealed with the authority of the state. And so the society began to fracture, not from within, but under the weight of external accusations it could not properly answer. After all, how does one defend a vow of obedience when the very act of defending it feels like disobedience? This question would deepen in Spain, where King Charles III followed suit and expelled all Jesuits in 1767 under charges so vague they could barely be documented. In Naples, in Parma, and elsewhere across Europe, the pattern repeated. Prussia built. In Rome, the very seat of their obedience, felt the tremors in 1773. The impossible happened. Pope Clement XIV, himself harried by political forces from every direction, signed a papal brief called Dominus AC Redemptor. Its purpose, the official suppression of the Society of Jesus. In quiet words, the document acknowledged their spiritual contributions, but concluded that their presence had caused too much division and unrest. The order was to be dissolved, their missions closed, their vows released to the outside world. It seemed the vow had finally been revoked. But here, the story becomes stranger and more telling, because many Jesuits, even after the suppression, continued to live as if the vow still bound them. Some were sheltered by Catherine the Great in Russia, where the papal brief was never promulgated. There, they kept teaching, kept writing, kept serving, cautiously but openly. Others faded into civilian life, still practicing poverty and obedience without title or recognition. In China and parts of the Americas, the news of the suppression arrived slowly, and some missionaries continued on for years, unaware they had been disbanded. The vow, you see, did not vanish with the ink of a papal decree. It lived on in silence, and it is this silence, the quiet persistence of men who obeyed even when unrecognized, that gives the vow its unsettling mystique, because a Jesuit, even suppressed, remained a Jesuit in heart. That frightened many. After all, what could be more dangerous than a man who still serves a master no longer visible? But from within the society, this was not defiance. It was fidelity. One former Jesuit, writing anonymously in the 1780s, described it like this: "Though our names have been erased and our buildings emptied, we are still what we always were, men who listen, who go, who do not ask if the journey will end." By 1814, after Napoleon's fall and the reordering of Europe, the society was formally restored by Pope Pius VII. In the intervening years, enough had changed that the Jesuits were welcomed once again, though not without suspicion. But the scars of suppression remained, not just as historical wounds, but as questions that still hovered around the nature of the vow itself. Why had the Jesuits inspired such fear in so many regimes? Was it their obedience, their influence, their apparent ability to persist, even without official sanction? Or was it the vow, the fourth vow, that troubled people the most? After all, the vow had been described, officially, as one of special obedience to the Pope regarding missions. But over time, whispers turned it into something darker, a vow of absolute obedience. One that could override conscience, politics, even morality. This idea was famously distorted in the 19th century by anti-Catholic authors, many of whom printed forged versions of the Jesuit oath in English-language pamphlets. These texts, lurid and dramatic, accused Jesuits of swearing loyalty unto death, of justifying murder, of pledging to infiltrate Protestant governments and destroy them from within. Of course, none of these versions had anything to do with the actual Jesuit formula, but the myth stuck in America. During periods of strong anti-Catholic sentiment, the so-called Jesuit oath was cited in political speeches. It even appeared in official congressional records, thanks to a senator who believed he was quoting authentic material. The real Jesuits, meanwhile, continued their quiet work in science, education, spiritual formation, never publicly confronting the myths that dogged them, but never backing away from the discipline that defined them. Because here's the uncomfortable truth: the vow is not what people fear. They fear what it represents. And what it represents is something profoundly out of step with the modern world. A life ordered not around self-expression, but around submission. Submission not to ideology or politics, but to mission, to being sent where one is needed rather than where one desires. In Jesuit formation, this mindset is cultivated slowly, even painfully. Man may desire to teach philosophy in Paris, but be asked instead to serve in a remote town in Madagascar. Another may wish to write books, but be told to care for the sick. These decisions are not arbitrary. They are made by discernment, a careful process guided by spiritual directors, superiors, and long conversations rooted in prayer and reason. But when the assignment comes, the answer is meant to be simple. Yes, this kind of obedience, thoughtful, voluntary, sustained, is hard to comprehend in an age where autonomy is sacred. And yet, for the Jesuits, it is not the negation of self, it is the offering of self. That offering, quiet as it is, still unsettles many, because it implies that a man's deepest freedom lies not in choosing his path, but in yielding it, trusting that his path will be chosen well by another. In the next and final section, we'll explore the vow as it exists today, not in dusty archives or imagined conspiracies, but in real lives of Jesuits in refugee camps, climate research centers, remote parishes, and international classrooms. We'll ask, what does obedience look like now, in a world where faith itself is often questioned? And, perhaps more curiously, does the vow still matter in a time when silence is mistaken for absence and obedience for invisibility? It is late evening in a Jesuit house in northern Kenya. The walls are bare, the furniture is plain, the kettle hums quietly on the stove, and a breeze drifts through a screened window. Beyond the courtyard, the hills darken. A man in his 70s, wearing worn sandals and a shirt with 2 missing buttons, finishes writing in a small notebook. He will rise at 5 a.m., just as he has every day for the past 39 years. He is a Jesuit, a priest, a teacher, and a man under a vow. He has no retirement plan, no parish of his own, no personal property. His room contains 2 shelves of books, a small crucifix, and a photograph of a mission school built from mud bricks. He has not seen his family in over 2 decades, but he has been obedient, not in grand gestures, but in small, unseen decisions that have stretched across a lifetime. And in this way, the vow still lives. It lives in Nairobi, where young Jesuits serve in slums so densely packed that rainwater seeps through rooftops at night. Lives in refugee camps in Lebanon, where they teach math by candlelight. It lives in research institutes in Belgium, where physicists still wear the Roman collar while running data through particle simulators. It lives in China, in Argentina, and Alaska, hint in war zones, so dangerous that even the Vatican rarely speaks of them out loud. The vow, the 4th vow of obedience to the Pope regarding missions, is not a relic. It is a quiet system of trust, a thread that pulls Jesuits forward without fanfare, and yet it remains misunderstood. Today, even many Catholics are unsure of what Jesuits really vowed to do. They know the basics: poverty, chastity, obedience, the same vows taken by most religious orders. But the Jesuits are different. The Society of Jesus was founded in a time of intellectual turbulence, war, and reform. It was shaped by military discipline, but tempered by mystical prayer. From the very beginning, it asked more. The founder, Ignatius of Loyola, had been a soldier before he became a saint. He believed in obedience, not as blind submission, but as a form of inner detachment, of freedom from self-will so complete that it could allow a man to be shaped, fully and humbly, by purpose. That purpose was service. That shaping required silence. In his Constitutions of the Society of Jesus, Ignatius explained that the Jesuits' obedience was not mechanical. It required discernment. Superiors were to listen to the men they assigned. Jesuits were to pray before decisions. Disagreements could be voiced, but once a direction was chosen, once the will of God had been discerned, the answer had to be full, generous, and swift. There should be no delay, no murmur, no looking back, he wrote. Like a staff in the hand of an old man, so must a Jesuit be in the hand of God. And so, for centuries, Jesuits have lived this strange paradox: rigorous thought paired with total trust, intellectual liberty within a framework of spiritual direction. This structure has created both admiration and suspicion. Too many secular observers. Heisey feels incompatible with modern life. In an era that prizes individual choice, self-optimization, and personal freedom, the idea of surrendering one's will to another, even voluntarily, seems archaic, even dangerous. What if the superior is wrong? What if the Pope's directive is politically motivated? What if obedience causes more harm than good? These are fair questions. The Jesuits themselves have asked them. In recent decades, the Society has wrestled with missions in complex environments: military dictatorships, economic collapses, civil wars. There have been cases, well documented, where obedience led Jesuits into situations that compromised safety or visibility. Some were arrested, others disappeared. A few were quietly recalled, reassigned, or left to work in silence. And yet, the vow remains. But perhaps that is the point. Obedience in the Jesuit context is not about certainty. It is about trust. Not blind, but chosen. Not passive, but active. Today, the process of taking final vows in the Society of Jesus is long, often 15 to 20 years. A Jesuit begins as a novice, then studies philosophy, then theology, then serves in ministry, then undergoes what is known as tertianship, a final stage of spiritual formation that includes a 30-day silent retreat and a renewed experience of discernment. Only then, if approved, does he take his final vows, and only some take the 4th vow of obedience to the Pope, which is reserved for those being sent on mission by the society itself. And so, when a modern Jesuit kneels in a chapel and places his hands in the hands of his superior, he knows exactly what he is promising. He is promising to go wherever, however, whenever. There is no glamour, no ceremony that trends on social media. The chapel is usually quiet, the candlelight steady, the crucifix unchanged. But that simple gesture, the placing of hands, is what terrifies conspiracy theorists, intrigues historians, and perplexes even other religious orders, because it feels like a secret. But in truth, it is not. The Jesuits publish their constitutions. They publish their formation documents, explain their vows on public websites. Its vow is no more secret than a menu on a wall. It is only misunderstood because it is so foreign to modern instincts. Even within the church, there are tensions, okay? Some bishops see the Jesuits as too political. Some cardinals have accused them of being too independent. And even some popes, ironically, have mistrusted them. But that, too, is part of the history. Jesuits have always operated in liminal space between academia and faith, between tradition and change, between order and liberty. Their vow does not silence them. It disciplines them. And perhaps that is what unsettles people most, that a man can be brilliant, autonomous, well-traveled, and yet still place his life under another's command, not because he must, but because he believes it will make him more useful. This is not the vow of a spy, or a fanatic, or a zealot. It is the vow of a servant, one who believes the mission is bigger than his own plans. And so, the myth of the Jesuit vow, the idea that it hides dark allegiance, secret power, or global manipulation, fades in the face of reality. The real vow is more difficult, more ordinary. It's more demanding than fiction allows. It is about answering an email at midnight that says, "We need you in Ukraine," and going. It is about giving a lecture on quantum physics in the morning and serving soup to refugees at night without needing credit. It is about dying in a mission station in the Amazon, unremembered, and being content. No dramatic odes, no whispered conspiracies, just a lifetime of quiet yeses. And perhaps, if there is a secret in the Jesuit vow, it is this: that power lies not in domination, but in availability. That greatness lies not in visibility, but in readiness. That the deepest freedom is not freedom from, but freedom for. A freedom for the other, for the poor, for the forgotten, for God. And so, if you ever hear about the Black Pope, the superior general of the Jesuits, and wonder what secret powers he wields, imagine instead a man sitting in a modest room, reading a letter from a remote corner of the world. And imagine him quietly saying yes, not because he must, okay, but because someone else once said yes to him. And that is how the vow continues, not in stone or secrecy or conspiracy, but in the slow, quiet obedience of men who are willing to be sent, even when no one is watching, even when no one will ever know. And perhaps that is the truest mystery of all.